The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of copper and gold, but Luke Harris felt only the cold weight of steel against his ribs. Yesterday's heroism had become today's curse. He had saved Nahima from 3 drifters who would have taken more than her dignity, but in doing so, he had stolen something far more precious from her people, their right to protect their own. Now, as he watched the Apache warriors emerge from the desert like shadows given form, Luke understood that some acts of mercy carry the seeds of war. The woman he had protected stood among them, her towering frame rigid with conflict, her dark eyes holding secrets that could either damn him or save him. Subscribe to discover if love can survive when honor demands blood. The coffee in Luke's tin cup had grown cold hours ago, but he held it still, watching the steam that no longer rose from its black surface. Through the kitchen window of his modest ranch house, the desert stretched endlessly, its silence broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. He had built this place with his own hands, every board and nail a testament to his determination to carve out something permanent in a land that seemed to shift like sand beneath a man's feet. The walls that had once felt like protection now seemed thin as paper, inadequate against what was coming. His fingers traced the rim of the cup, remembering how those same hands had pulled Nahima from the clutches of men who saw her only as prey. The memory burned brighter than the desert sun, and with it came the knowledge that he would make the same choice again. Consequences be damned. The sound of his horse, Dusty, nickering nervously in the corral, drew Luke's attention back to the present. The animal's ears were pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he tested the wind for scents that spoke of danger. Luke had learned to trust the instincts of desert creatures. They could sense trouble long before human eyes could spot it on the horizon. He set down the cup and moved to the window, his hand instinctively checking the Colt .45 at his hip. The weapon felt heavier today, weighted not just with lead and steel, but with the possibility of using it against people who had every right to seek justice for what they saw as his transgression. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had saved one of their own, yet, in their eyes, he had committed a crime simply by being white, by being male, by being there when their warrior woman needed help. Yesterday felt like a lifetime ago, though the sun had set and risen only once since he had encountered Nahima by the creek that marked the boundary between his land and Apache territory. She had been magnificent, even in distress, her long black hair streaming behind her as she fought against the 3 drifters who had cornered her while she gathered medicinal herbs. Luke had acted without thinking, his sense of right and wrong overriding any consideration of tribal politics or cultural boundaries. The fight had been brief but brutal, leaving 2 men unconscious and one fleeing into the desert on foot, nursing a broken arm and a shattered pride. Nahima had looked at him with eyes that held both gratitude and something deeper, something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. The memory of her voice still echoed in his mind, low and musical despite the circumstances, as she had thanked him in careful English before disappearing into the desert as silently as she had appeared. He had watched her go, noting the proud set of her shoulders and the way she moved with the fluid grace of someone born to this harsh land. There had been a moment just before she vanished among the rocks and scrub brush when she had turned back to look at him. And in that glance, Luke had seen a reflection of his own confusion and longing. It was a look that spoke of possibilities that could never be explored, of a connection that transcended the artificial boundaries men drew between themselves and called civilization. Now, as he stood at his window, watching the desert for signs of movement, Luke wondered if that moment of connection would be enough to save his life, or if it would only make his death more meaningful to the woman who might be forced to watch it. The Apache were not known for their mercy toward those who interfered in their affairs, regardless of the nobility of their intentions. He had heard stories around campfires and in saloons, tales of white men who had crossed invisible lines and paid for it with their scalps. Yet he felt no regret for his actions, only a deep sadness that the world was such a place where saving a life could be construed as an act of war. The desert wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, something that spoke of approaching storm. Luke moved away from the window and began to prepare for what was coming, checking his rifle and counting his ammunition with the methodical precision of a man who had faced death before and expected to face it again. He thought of Nahima as he worked, wondering if she was among the warriors who would soon surround his ranch, wondering if she would speak for him or against him when the time came for judgment. The not knowing was perhaps the cruelest part of his situation. To be caught between hope and despair, between the memory of gratitude in dark eyes and the reality of tribal justice that recognized no debt to outsiders. The first sign came with the silence, a sudden, unnatural quiet that fell over the desert like a held breath. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the very air was waiting for something to break the tension that had been building since dawn. Luke stood on his porch, rifle cradled in his arms, watching the horizon shimmer in the heat as shapes began to materialize from what had seemed like empty landscape moments before. They came like ghosts made flesh, Apache warriors emerging from behind rocks and scrub brush where no hiding place should have existed, their presence transforming the familiar terrain into something alien and threatening. The skill with which they had approached unseen spoke of generations of desert warfare, of a people who had learned to become one with the land that white men still saw as empty space to be conquered. Nahima appeared among them like a vision from a fevered dream, her tall frame unmistakable even at a distance, her presence both a comfort and a torment to the man who watched from his porch. She rode a paint horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, her long hair flowing free in the desert breeze, her face a mask of controlled emotion that revealed nothing of her thoughts. Luke's heart hammered against his ribs as he counted the warriors, 12 in all, each one armed and painted for war, their faces streaked with colors that spoke of serious intent. Yet it was Nahima who commanded his attention, Nahima whose very presence made this confrontation personal rather than merely political, whose dark eyes held the power to determine whether he would see another sunset. The leader of the war party was an older man whose scarred face spoke of countless battles, his grey-streaked hair braided with feathers and beads that marked his status within the tribe. He rode slightly ahead of the others, his posture erect and proud, his eyes fixed on Luke with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey. This would be a chief or war leader, someone with the authority to speak for the tribe and the power to decide Luke's fate with a gesture. The cowboy felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing, measuring him, judging him, finding him wanting in ways that had nothing to do with his actions and everything to do with the color of his skin and the culture that had shaped him. As the warriors formed a loose circle around his ranch, Luke noticed the careful way they positioned themselves, cutting off all avenues of escape while maintaining enough distance to avoid his rifle fire, should he choose to make a fight of it. It was a tactical formation that spoke of military precision and long experience in dealing with armed white men who might prefer death to capture. Yet there was something almost ceremonial about their arrangement, as if this were not merely a military operation, but a ritual with its own ancient rules and protocols. Luke found himself wondering what those rules might be, what chance he might have of surviving this encounter, if he could understand the cultural currents that flowed beneath the surface of what appeared to be a simple confrontation. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, each side waiting for the other to make the first move, to speak the first word that would determine the direction of what was to come. Luke could feel sweat beading on his forehead, despite the morning chill, could hear his own heartbeat loud in his ears as he struggled to maintain his composure in the face of overwhelming odds. He thought of his parents back in Kansas, of the letters he had written but never sent, of all the things he had meant to do with his life that would now remain forever undone. Yet beneath the fear and regret, he felt a strange sense of peace, an acceptance of the consequences of his choice that surprised him with its completeness. Nahima's horse shifted restlessly, and for a moment her eyes met Luke's across the distance that separated them, a look that lasted only seconds, but seemed to contain entire conversations. In that brief connection, he saw conflict warring in her dark gaze, gratitude struggling against duty, personal feeling battling tribal loyalty, the woman fighting against the warrior. It was a look that gave him hope, even as it broke his heart, for it told him that whatever happened here today, he had not been wrong about the connection he had felt between them. She was not merely another Apache warrior come to seek vengeance. She was a woman torn between two worlds, just as he was a man caught between his conscience and his survival. The war leader finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air, the Apache words flowing like music despite their ominous intent. Luke did not understand the language, but he could hear the formality in the tone, the ritual cadence that suggested this was more than mere conversation. This was ceremony, judgment, the formal pronouncement of charges that would determine his fate. The desert held its breath as ancient justice prepared to meet frontier mercy, and only Nahima's voice could tip the scales between life and death. Escreva os capítulos 3-5. The circle tightened like a noose around Luke's throat, each warrior's painted face a mask of ancestral fury. Chief Mangas stepped forward, his weathered hands gripping a war lance that had tasted the blood of 3 generations of enemies. The morning sun caught the silver in his braided hair, transforming him into a living monument to Apache pride. Luke felt the weight of his Colt against his hip, useless as a prayer in a thunderstorm. The chief's eyes held no mercy, only the cold calculation of a man who had watched his people's sacred lands shrink beneath the boots of white settlers. This was not about one woman or one cowboy. This was about the survival of a way of life that bled with every sunrise. Nahima's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk, her Apache words flowing with the rhythm of ancient songs. She spoke of honor, of debts unpaid, of the sacred law that bound her people to protect those who had shown kindness without expectation of reward. Her towering frame commanded attention even among warriors, her presence a force that made grown men step back in respect. Luke watched her argue for his life in a language he couldn't understand, her gestures painting pictures in the air that spoke of courage and sacrifice. The wind carried her words across the desert, where they seemed to echo off distant mesas like the voices of spirits long departed. Every syllable was a gamble with death, every pause a moment where his fate hung in the balance. The warriors murmured among themselves, their voices a low rumble like distant thunder before a storm. Luke caught fragments of meaning in their expressions, doubt warring with tradition, respect battling with suspicion. Some nodded at Nahima's words, while others shook their heads, their loyalty to ancient ways stronger than any argument she could make. The chief raised his hand for silence, and the desert fell quiet, except for the whisper of wind through sagebrush and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Luke felt sweat trickle down his spine despite the morning chill, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The moment stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point, ready to snap and send an arrow of judgment straight through his chest. Chief Mangas spoke, his voice carrying the weight of mountains and the authority of countless winters. His words were measured, deliberate, each one falling like a stone into still water. Luke didn't need translation to understand the gravity of what was being decided. He could read it in the chief's eyes, in the way the warriors shifted their weight from foot to foot, in the sudden stillness that gripped Nahima's powerful frame. The old man gestured toward the rising sun, then to the 4 directions, invoking powers older than memory. His lance pointed first at Luke, then at Nahima, drawing invisible lines that connected their fates like threads in a spider's web. The ritual of judgment had begun, and there would be no turning back from whatever verdict emerged from this circle of painted warriors. Nahima stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance that would have made eagles weep with envy. She placed her hand over her heart and spoke a single word that rang across the desert like a bell tolling for the dead. The warriors gasped, some taking involuntary steps backward as if she had struck them with lightning. Luke saw shock ripple through the circle, followed by something that might have been fear or respect. He couldn't tell which. The chief's eyes widened, his weathered face showing the first crack in its stoic mask. Whatever Nahima had said, it had changed everything, shifting the balance of power like a landslide that rearranges an entire mountainside. The morning air crackled with tension so thick Luke could taste it, metallic and sharp like blood on his tongue. The silence that followed was deeper than any Luke had ever experienced, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Chief Mangas lowered his lance slowly, his eyes never leaving Nahima's face. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, not the harsh judgment of a war chief, but the careful consideration of a man weighing the souls of the living against the demands of the dead. Luke felt something shift in the circle, a subtle change in the warrior's posture that spoke of possibilities he hadn't dared imagine. The sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, and for the first time since dawn, Luke allowed himself to believe he might live to see another sunset. But as hope flickered to life in his chest, he realized that survival might come at a price higher than death itself. Chief Mangas raised his weathered hand toward the climbing sun, his fingers spread wide as if trying to catch the light itself. His voice carried across the desert with the authority of wind through canyon walls, speaking words that seemed to reshape the very air around them. Luke watched Nahima's face transform as the chief's pronouncement unfolded, her warrior's mask cracking to reveal something raw and vulnerable beneath. The other warriors began to lower their weapons, but their eyes held a mixture of confusion and reluctant acceptance that spoke of traditions being bent to their breaking point. The morning heat was building, turning the circle of men into a furnace of sweat and tension, where ancient laws wrestled with unprecedented circumstances. Luke felt the weight of their stares like physical blows, each gaze measuring him against standards he could never hope to understand. The chief's words painted pictures in the air that Luke could almost grasp, images of tests and trials, of proving worth through actions rather than blood. Nahima translated in broken English, her voice thick with emotions she couldn't name. He says, "You must walk the path of the warrior, 3 trials. If you survive, if you prove your heart is true." She paused, her dark eyes searching his face for something she wasn't sure she wanted to find. "You may choose your fate. Stay and become one of us, or leave and never return." The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, beautiful and terrible in their implications. Luke felt the ground shift beneath his feet, not from earthquake, but from the sudden realization that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. The first trial would begin at sunset, when the desert transformed from furnace to icebox and shadows grew long enough to hide a man's fears. Chief Mangas gestured toward the distant mesas, their red faces glowing like coals in the morning light. Luke would have to survive a night alone in the sacred canyons, armed with nothing but his wits and whatever courage he could summon from the depths of his soul. The warriors spoke among themselves in hushed tones, some shaking their heads while others nodded with grim approval. Nahima stood apart from them all, her towering frame silhouetted against the brightening sky like a statue carved from living stone. Luke wanted to reach for her, to touch her hand and feel some connection to the world he was about to leave behind. But the circle of warriors made such gestures impossible. As the sun climbed higher, the warriors began to disperse, melting back into the desert like mirages fading in the heat. Some mounted their horses and rode toward distant camps, while others simply walked away until they disappeared behind rocks and sagebrush. Chief Mangas remained, his ancient eyes studying Luke with the intensity of a hawk watching a mouse. He spoke a few words to Nahima, his tone carrying the weight of final instructions, then turned and walked toward his horse with the measured pace of a man who had seen too many sunrises to hurry toward another. Luke found himself alone with Nahima for the first time since the circle had formed, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words and impossible choices. Nahima's hand brushed against his arm, a touch so brief it might have been imagined, but Luke felt it burn through his shirt like a brand. "The trials are not just about survival," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. "They are about becoming. If you succeed, you will not be the same man who saved me from those bandits." Her eyes held depths he was only beginning to explore, pools of darkness that reflected starlight even in the blazing day. Luke nodded, understanding more than her words conveyed. This wasn't just about proving his worth to her people, it was about discovering whether he had the strength to love a woman whose world was so different from his own that it might as well exist on another planet. The morning stretched toward noon, each minute bringing him closer to a sunset that would either mark his death or his rebirth. Luke looked back at his ranch house, its weathered walls and familiar shadows suddenly seeming like artifacts from another man's life. The cattle in the distance moved like brown dots across the landscape, their simple existence a reminder of the world he was preparing to leave behind. Nahima followed his gaze, her expression unreadable as stone. "Regret is a luxury warriors cannot afford," she said, but her voice carried a tremor that suggested she understood the weight of what she was asking him to sacrifice. The sun reached its zenith, and Luke realized that by the time it set again, he would either be dead or transformed into something he couldn't yet imagine, and both possibilities terrified him equally. The sun hung like a bleeding wound in the western sky, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold that made the rocks look like they were on fire. Luke stood at the edge of the sacred canyon, his hands empty, except for a single eagle feather that Chief Mangus had pressed into his palm before disappearing into the gathering shadows. The canyon yawned before him like the mouth of some ancient beast, its walls carved by wind and water into shapes that seemed to move in the flickering light. Nahima had walked him to this place in silence, her presence both comfort and torment as the moment of separation approached. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something wild and untamed that spoke of spirits older than memory. "The ancestors will test you tonight," Nahima said, her voice barely a whisper against the growing darkness. "They will show you visions, speak to you in voices you've never heard. Some men go mad, others find wisdom." Her hand touched his cheek, a gesture so tender it nearly broke his resolve. Luke felt the warmth of her skin against his face, memorizing the texture and the way her fingers trembled despite her warrior's composure. The canyon below them seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, a rhythm that matched the blood pounding in his ears. He wanted to tell her he loved her, wanted to speak the words that might be his last, but the magnitude of what lay ahead stole his voice like smoke stealing breath from a fire. The first stars appeared as Luke began his descent into the canyon, their light too faint to illuminate the treacherous path that wound between towering walls of stone. Each step took him deeper into a world where white men's rules held no power, where the only law was survival, and the only judge was the desert itself. The walls rose around him like the ribs of some massive creature, their surfaces covered with ancient paintings that seemed to watch his progress with eyes that had witnessed 1,000 years of human struggle. The temperature dropped with each foot of elevation he lost, the desert's cruel joke of burning days and freezing nights beginning to assert itself. Luke pulled his jacket tighter and pressed on, following a path that seemed to exist more in memory than in reality. Hours passed, like centuries, as Luke navigated the labyrinth of stone and shadow, his boots finding purchase on rocks worn smooth by countless seasons of rain and wind. The canyon walls whispered with voices he couldn't understand, speaking in languages that predated English by millennia. Sometimes he thought he heard Nahima calling his name, But when he turned toward the sound, he found only empty air and the echo of his own breathing. The eagle feather in his hand seemed to glow with its own light, a beacon that guided him through passages so narrow he had to turn sideways to pass. The darkness was complete now, a living thing that pressed against him from all sides, testing his courage with every step. Near midnight, Luke found himself in a circular chamber where the canyon walls opened like a flower toward the star-filled sky above. Ancient symbols covered every surface, their meanings lost to time, but their power still palpable in the thin air. He sat on a flat stone in the center of the space, his body exhausted, but his mind strangely alert. The silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat, a steady rhythm that seemed to sync with some deeper pulse emanating from the earth itself. The eagle feather grew warm in his hand, and suddenly the chamber filled with a light that had no source, illuminating the painted walls until they seemed to move and breathe with life of their own. The visions began as whispers of movement in his peripheral vision, shapes that vanished when he turned to look directly at them. Then the voices started, not heard but felt, vibrating through his bones like the memory of thunder. Luke saw himself as a child, running through fields that would one day become his ranch. He saw his father's death, his mother's tears, the long years of loneliness that had driven him to this empty corner of Arizona. But then the visions shifted, showing him futures he had never imagined, himself standing beside Nahima as she led her people through trials yet to come, his hands dark with earth and his heart full of purposes larger than his own survival. The chamber spun around him like a whirlpool of time and possibility, and Luke felt himself dissolving into something larger than the man who had entered the canyon at sunset. When dawn finally broke over the canyon rim, painting the ancient walls in shades of rose and gold, Luke Harris knew that the man who climbed back into the world of the living would carry within him the dreams and responsibilities of two peoples, bound together by love and tested by forces older than the stones themselves.